Now we will have another keynote presentation by Dr.Soumyabrata Choudhury on statelessness and sovereignty, a critical analysis of citizenship denial in South Asia. I'm requesting Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury to come on stage and present the keynote presentation.
So, I'm deeply honored to be invited to speak both in this conference, these discussions, but also in the context of these discussions, which is nothing less than an uprising, a real event which marks our times. In Bangladesh, in South Asia, which includes Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, at least, and even more so, everyone. Bangladesh for all, the uprising for all. So I'm deeply honored to be part of such a moment. I have no other qualification to speak among such great authorities on Bangladesh and history of Bangladesh. I have no such competence, apart from this enthusiasm I have for this real event. So thank you so much. Let me briefly talk about this question of citizenship and sovereignty. The word citizen, in English of course, derives in the immediate proximity, nearness, to the French word, which became well known since the French Revolution. But it has a longer history which goes back, at least in Western politics, to ancient Greece. But there's a difference between the word citizen as it was used in ancient Greece, particularly in its periods of democracy, and its context of the French Revolution. During the Greek period, the word citizen actually meant a class of people who would be citizens within a delimited geographical territorial boundary and would both be objects of government but also be the governors themselves. So it was a kind of collective self-government done by citizens, but within the perimeter, the limited space of that particular city, in this case, the Greek city of Athens. So citizenship was a paradoxical idea in Athens or in Greece. Athenians were citizens. To that extent, they were constituted by a value of equality. But non-Athenians, for instance, Sparta, neighboring to Athens, which Athens was fighting a war with, were not considered to be capable of being citizens because they were not considered human enough. So citizenship was something which was a particular value shared by a community or a class of human beings. To that extent, it was a value of equality or community, but at the same time, it was exclusionary because some other human beings from some other territory were not capable of being citizens at all or governing themselves at all. This idea, at least in principle, changed since the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, though it was a specific revolution at a particular part of the world, that is in Europe, at least the idea was that the revolutionary possibility is open to everyone. though it was a period of colonialism and France itself was a colonial country. But we know that within 10 years of the French Revolution, there was a Haitian revolution conducted by the colonized people of Haiti, and the Haitian revolution said, we are the truer French Revolution than France itself. So in that sense, we had a new idea of citizens. It was not the citizen of a country. It was not the citizen of a state. It was not the citizen of a particular legal entity or a territorial delimited space. It was the idea of a citizen of an event, which is also called revolution, or if you will, in the light of July last year in Bangladesh, citizen of an uprising. So these are two meanings of citizens, or the word citizen, which both concern us today in a very real way in this region of the world, South Asia. Because when I come from India, when in India, some years back, we made a law, which was a citizenship amendment law, which excluded a certain set of possible citizens based on a particular identity, which is a community or even religious identity, then what it fundamentally brought back was the earlier idea of citizen that yes, as far as we are citizens, say Indian citizens, we in principle are equal, but to be Indian is already a mark of a certain kind of separation or exclusion from something like non-Indian, and that non-Indian can extend to another religion, another language, another ethnicity, and every other sort of very deeply problematical and dangerous inegalitarian value, which citizenship in the first place was meant to fight against. So in South Asia, we are both confronted with this danger and paradox, but we also have enormous possibilities of fighting this danger with great strength and intelligence. And in a way, what happened in Bangladesh, it promises that hope that we can be citizens not of a country merely, but of an event. In that sense, citizens of July 2024, each of us. And when I see all of you young people organizing this, then I see citizens. Not citizens merely of this particular, area called Dacca, part of Dacca society in Bangladesh. But I see a possibility which is universal. There is a song by the Bengali singer, poet, Shuman Chatterjee, Kobir Shuman, where the refrain line in Bengali is, Amaderi jonne. Again and again he says, Amaderi jonne. At the end he says, Shobbar jonne. So in that sense, July, Shobbar jonne. But that is the hope and principle. But what is the problem? The problem is that the question of citizenship, precisely because it is a question of power, it is a question of sovereignty, also becomes a stakes. It becomes a site of manipulation, of mobilization, including in legitimate democratic elections, which are sometimes, of course, won through fraud, but often won through legitimate means, but deeply problematical means of polarization, of division. And those are also fought on the grounds of, strangely, citizenship. The Indian case of anti-CA is one of that. And there is a logic behind it. But what is really the question of the stake? The question of the stake is that insofar as citizenship is something which is a kind of power, it is also something to be competed for. Citizenship becomes thought of like an economic commodity, like a utilitarian commodity. That's why the word empowerment, which is very useful in some regards, is also very misleading in another way. when we speak of empowerment, we seem to think too instrumentally, as if citizens are empowered to do something and achieve something only for citizens. So it becomes an intra-citizen world from which some will always be excluded. For instance, in the other great big democracy of the world, probably the biggest, America, today it's the most violent sight when every day the President of America speaks against immigrants. Who are immigrants? Constitutively excluded from the idea of citizenship. And often that exclusion is imagined or portrayed in terms of not at all something sober and analytical like legal rights and economic rights, but in terms of social, imaginary, paranoid images. So for instance, we hear the American president go on, to press conferences and speak of so-called immigrants as scavengers. Coming from India, which is a caste society, the word scavenger is very, very disturbing. Very disturbing, and I'm sure even, that is also South Asian knowledge, which is a disturbing knowledge, which even people in Bangladesh will not be unaware of. When an immigrant doesn't really get defined by the economic position of being an immigrant, but becomes some kind of a social point of exclusion, almost a point of racial or animal exclusion, as being called scavengers. So some of it is then retroactively justified on grounds of, and let me just quickly go to one ground in the Indian case, which can become highly ideological and even philosophical. So for instance, in the anti-CAA, the anti-CAA was an agitation. But the CAA justification in India could be seen, though it's not explicitly mentioned by the Indian government or the party which has been holding power in India for a long time. So, the party which holds power, its old parent organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and even before that, the Hindu Mahasabha, had an ideologue called Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar. And if you read some of his texts, ideological texts, he actually borrowed a monotheistic Orientalist notion of holy land. And in the kind of Hindi, Sanskritic Hindi, he translated it into, he called it Punya Bhumi. And he says that in every other way, say, the Muslim can be part of India, who has been living in India for many, many, generations, their families. But their Punya Bhumi is somewhere else. The holy land is somewhere else. And so, the Hindu's holy land is this one. That becomes a strange ideological ground for justifying eventually the most retrograde practices of citizenship, which both, again paradoxically, presents itself as egalitarian, but its practice is deeply, deeply divisive. So what is the solution? There is no solution because it is also partly endemic to the structure of citizenship. But there are certain guidelines, certain rules of conduct, ethical conduct that we can follow, and some of it can be inscribed in actual constitutions. So for instance, the American Constitution, its First Amendment is a very, very powerful rule, a kind of rule of the mind. So American Constitution's First Amendment, which gives you the right to free speech, is not limited to the citizens of America. It is for everyone. The American president today is trying to destroy that principle by what he calls common sense. And common sense says, according to him, that, oh, sure, everyone in America has free speech. You mean American citizens, right? Hence, Palestinian protesters, because they're Palestinian or from some other country, surely they don't have the right to, go out and disturb the peace of our neighborhoods by protesting. So some of them can be sent off to jails or to, jails in El Salvador or Uganda or somewhere else for the apparent common sense that they are not citizens. And yet it is in the American Constitution that it is, the First Amendment says that there's a right to free speech for everyone in America. In Article 14 of the Indian Constitution, the principle is very good. The right to equality before law is not limited to citizens. It is to everyone here and now in India. I think these little but profound hints in living constitutions can really be guidelines for future egalitarian practice, not so much of sovereignty, but of the original idea of the French Revolution, which is to be citizens of an event which is not just in the here and now, not just in July, but an eternal July. And so my last point today is, and very quickly in two parts, both related to the contemporary moment. First, in Bangladesh, when you speak so clearly, so lucidly about 71, 91, and 2024, you have the ruptural events. You also speak of figures, persona, historical people. The historical people's role will be evaluated differently as something like that is happening in Bangladesh today. But the event will produce its effects beyond the image or the figuration or the way we look at people from our own histories. We can glorify them one day and we can really put them down another. That happens in all histories. But the events will be of another logic. So we have to become subjects and events, and that is not limited to a single region, single history. And so on the other side, we have the question of, and that's my last point, and I'm taking 2 minutes extra, sorry for that. In Israel today, we have something like a notion that for the security of Israeli citizens, the most shameless genocidal murder can be committed because it's for the security of the Israeli citizen. The Israeli citizen can be the cause for the greatest suffering to any other non-Israeli, in this case, people who live right next to Israel in Gaza. And that is apparently all right. I heard an Israeli podcaster say that every Jew who still doesn't agree with Israel or doesn't live in Israel is not a sovereign Jew. A Jew can only become sovereign once he finally or she reaches Israel. Again, the idea of Punya Bhumi, the myth of a Punya Bhumi, comes back. As against that, the Jewish philosopher Giorgio Agamben, in a short text, melancholically but clearly announces that what Israel is doing today against Palestinians in Gaza is the end of Judaism. Why? Because the so-called Jewish people, and any people for that matter, the greatest possibility was that they could be thought of as a people and not merely citizens, a people without state, and yet a free people. I think we should not let go of that idea of a free people without a state and yet trying to found a meaningful state for ourselves. Thank you for your attention.